This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. It is the second of my shows on the great musical composers. Erik Satie is up this time, and I have two experts that will speak on his life and his music, and the conversation will begin in a moment. The subject is classical music, and Erik Satie is in the spotlight. I have two women, Helen Miners and Caroline Potter. They will be talking about his life and his career. As I usually like to do, I want to give both of my guests a little time to talk about themselves, anything they have written on the subject, what drew them to it, and so forth. So on the viewer's left is Helen. Helen, if you could give a little bit of background about yourself and what drew you to Satie and his music.
Hello. What drew me to Satie is actually the fact he reminds me of Swan in the sense that it's so elegant to look at him. It's so elegant to see his sketches and his annotations, the way he writes. But it constantly seems to me that he's working really hard under the surface to change what he's doing. So I've always had this question from being quite young, actually, of why he's done what he's done. He seems to strip back the instrumentation and work with different artists and different art forms in a way that seems to change the traditions of the time. So for me, I find him quite exciting because he worked with so many different art forms, including obviously working to contemporary media and film in the end. So really what's got me from that idea back to him, I started to work on the idea of written for dance with the start of the 20th century in France, which I worked on my PhD, specifically looking at the music of E-Cosmoetica and the ballet La Pairie. And the idea of La Pairie's scenario being based on pre-Islam actually drew me back again to Satie and his ballet work, obviously because he's got some characters of Persians, but connected actually quite strongly with the scenario. And it's something I'm about to look at. But mostly with Satie, I've written a couple of chapters on his Sport et Divertissement. So that is really where he's writing music in response to visual imagery, and he's including poetry and text within that particular work. But most of my writings explore the transfer of sense either between music and dance or between music and text and visual art. So that interplay, that transfer between media is really where all my work resides, whether that's on French music or whether that's in the improvisatory work I do.
Well, before I go on to Caroline, you mentioned a lot of the other art that he did outside of classical music, and he's probably most well known as a composer. Was he part of the turn of the 20th century scene with people like Guillaume Apollinaire and that kind of people in France?
Definitely. I actually used Apollinaire's idea of simultaneism as a way to look at his sport divertissement. So the idea that you have an immediate digestion of music and text and visual imagery all at once. So it's the idea that rather than necessarily exploring for one singular meaning, it's that emergent meaning for the spectator and what that means to them in their cultural context. So it's a bit more of a challenging way to look at the notion of musical meaning. But actually, as I was just talking to Caroline before we started to speak, one of the ideas that Satie wrote on the preface of Sport was don't look for anything else in it, and constantly that challenge not to do that has made me want to question how his music means in relation to something else and do the exact opposite.
Well, my other guest is Caroline Potter. She is on the right of the screen. Caroline, if you could give a little bit of background about yourself as well as talking about what has drawn you to the works of Satie.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm currently a visiting fellow at the Institute of Modern Languages Research of the University of London. Though before then I spent a lot of time lecturing in music departments, so my academic interests are both in music and in French specifically. I think I discovered Satie first as a teenager when I started to play the piano, and it will have been the Gymnopédie that I came across first, and the Notienne. They're such extraordinary pieces. They're not difficult to play, and yet there's something deeply moving about the simplicity, something very sincere about this music, I would say. So I was immediately drawn to the music, and what draws me to Satie as a researcher is really the fact he's not just a composer. He's somebody who existed in such an exciting time for the arts, late 19th century and early 20th century in Paris. He was involved with different art forms, and he collaborated with so many artists and writers. And I must promote my book. Here it is. It's got a lovely cover, Erik Satie, a Parisian composer and his world. Came out last year with Boydell Press, available at all good news agents.
Before we talk about his childhood and the music itself and what makes it good, I want to talk a little bit about Satie in contemporary times, pop culture, the late 20th century, early 21st century. As people can tell, you both have British accents. I'm calling you actually in the UK, and I'm here in the US. And in the US, there's an old cable television channel, although it's not actually cable television, but it shows old game shows. And I was watching an old American game show 2 or 3 months ago before I went to work, and I saw back in the 1960s, there was a fellow who came on, and his secret, it was a game show called I've Got a Secret, was that he had played the whole 840 vexations of Satie. But they didn't. But the idea is they didn't mention Satie by name, so I had no idea it was Satie's piece that was played over and over again. It took something like 18 hours for people. I guess he was one of 4 or 5 pianists. They rotated so they didn't get tired. And I guess it was at Radio City Music Hall or something, and that was his secret on this game show. And so he played. He played. Yeah, he played about 80 or 90 seconds worth of it, and or however long it goes to be repeated over and over again. And I didn't realize that it was John Cage. And I'm personally not one of. I'm not really a fan of John Cage. I think he's one of these sort of gimmick artists with the silence and the whatnot. But do you think that Satie, in a sense, was a precursor of people like Cage and in other art forms, abstract expressionism, and all of these other forms that sort of flowered and have this sort of, now I guess with several decades between, a sort of dubious reputation artistically? Do you see him as a jumping off point for people like Cage?
I think there are a few things to say before we get on to that. I think the guy on the game show was actually John Cale, who's Welsh. He was in the first performance of Vexation, as was Cage, but they're not the same person. The Vexation performance is not actually something that Satie wrote precisely should happen in his score. What Satie precisely wrote was, in order to play this piece to yourself 840 times, it would be good to prepare yourself in silence with extreme immobilities, something like that. And I think most people talking about Vexation have missed the important play to yourself bit. So I don't believe that this is something Satie intended for public performance. It was something that was not performed or published in his lifetime. So I think he saw it as a very much a private piece. The performing tradition of Vexation as a marathon started with John Cage, and there is in fact going to be another marathon performance of 840 repetitions in the Guggenheim Museum in New York very soon, featuring I think 5 of the original performers. So there's a real connection with this original Cage performance of it. Going back to your question, was Satie an influential figure to experimental artists? Yes, absolutely. John Cage once said that he's indispensable. I don't think it was so much Satie's music that Cage was attracted to. It was much more the ideas behind the music. Ideas such as music could be part of the environment, or it could be viewed alongside other art forms, completed by other art forms indeed. And beyond Cage, yes, Satie's been hugely influential on pop culture. He appears in adverts for dog food in the UK, for example, at the moment.
What exactly would the connection be there between dog food and Satie? Or is it just the music?
It's a rhetorical question, isn't it? But the fact is that people like the music and they think it's going to appeal to people. So presumably the dog food people thought, well, if you enjoy listening to Satie, let's have it in the background and it'll help you enjoy this particular product. Who knows?
I think there's an interesting thing about the mystery behind Erik Satie, though. As soon as you've mentioned his character, the fact that you've got music that's got text written on it, it's really about the eye, the self-absorbing something or the self-interpreting. If you're playing a piano work that's got text on it, or you're looking at a collage album that's got visual images, text and music, it really is about your own view of that. It's not something that you can engage on mass culture. And I do wonder whether for contemporary culture, certainly our students, whether they're getting something fresh from that when they're so used to looking at a single tablet or an iPhone, and they're used to engaging with something by themselves. And certainly the students that we're currently teaching, they're aware of Satie's music, and I've realised recently they're also aware of the collage album, which isn't something I would have anticipated. But they like the fact there's a certain mystery about the man that always dressed the same, that didn't let anyone into the flat, and they know about this aspect of him, even when they don't know all the musical pieces or they haven't heard them. So I think there's something about what he might have been and the myth that seems to have become Satie in the 21st century that the students are interested in.
There's also a good deal of ambiguity in Satie's work. As Helen has said, some of his piano pieces have text included in them. So you can ask the question, well, what do you do with these texts? Do you read them out when playing? Are they something which is purely a communication with the pianist? So there are lots of things like that in Satie where the meaning isn't clear, and I think it allows the reader and the listener to bring quite a lot of themselves to it, and it leaves space for people to add their own creativity to his work.
Well, quite. It allows for experimentation, because despite the fact that Satie said not to read the text out loud and Poulenc said you'd be dreading excommunication, you actually did an experiment yourself reading the text out loud, didn't you?
It's a possibility.
Yes, exactly.
One can play with it.
Yeah.
I want to talk about a couple of his most famous pieces, the Gymnopedias and Nocienza. We'll talk about it a bit more, the music in a broader text later. But here in America, Satie is quite often used because a lot of his stuff is in the public domain as musical scores for films. And here in America, probably the two most famous usages of him I can think of are in the film My Dinner with Andre, the Louis Malle film, where Gymnopédie No. 1 is used, and the same piece is used in a later 1980s film by Woody Allen called Another Woman. And I wanted to ask about that, because I know in the Woody Allen version it's listed as Gymnopédie No. 3, and there's some kind of I've heard an explanation that Debussy reworked it for an orchestra or something. So when it's known as Gymnopédie No. 1, it's just the piano as originally intended by Satie. But if it's used in a full orchestra, it's called Gymnopédie No. 3.
It's not quite accurate. There are 3 Gymnopédies.
Yeah.
Satie wrote 3 Gymnopédies for piano. They're very, very similar to each other. That's one very unusual thing about this set of pieces. Normally, when a classical composer writes a set of pieces, he or she would be looking to provide contrast for the listener and the pianist. Satie almost never does that. So you see him grouping pieces, usually in 3, but they're extremely similar in mood and even share quite a lot of musical and harmonic gestures between them. So the original is 3 Gymnopédies for piano, composed by Satie, but in the 1890s, Debussy orchestrated the first and third of the Gymnopédie. I don't know why he didn't orchestrate number two. That seems a rather odd decision to me, just to focus on two out of the three. Knowing Debussy, he might have just got bored and moved on to something else. But that's the story behind the Gymnopédie orchestrations.
I've been listening to a lot of classical music. It was one of the reasons I want to do these series on the composers, to educate myself on it. Because as I've gotten older, I've got a desire for more complexity generally in music rather than pop music, rock and roll that I grew up with. And one of the things that I've noticed as I've listened to some online stuff at YouTube where they have like a 2-hour video of the music of a certain person is just listening to all the different variations of some of the lesser known pieces. And I was also listening to Bela Bartok, and it seemed to me that Bartok, a lot of his piano pieces, some of his famous pieces in the late teens and early 20s, seemed to me to be almost answers to what Satie was doing. It's almost as if he wanted to go to the opposite extreme, this very aggressive, angry playing of the piano, whereas Satie seems to, more often than not always, but more often than not, be on the opposite end. Was Bartok influenced by Satie, and was a lot of his piano pieces, the most famous ones, I forget the name of them, but that very dun 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 dun, were they in response to Satie, do you think?
I don't think he had any contact with Satie whatsoever.
No?
You have to remember that during Satie's lifetime, he died in 1925, he was known by a fairly small avant-garde circle in Paris. He almost never travelled. One or two of his pieces were performed in the States during his lifetime, in the 1920s, but he really wasn't very well known as a composer. He was notorious for his collaborations with ballet companies, so he did get a bit of newspaper headlines through that. But I think it's most unlikely that Bartok was influenced by Satie.
I agree, but the shared connection there really is that the composers are experimenting with different timbres and textures, isn't it? The one thing that I would say, for me, there is a connection, is the fact that we know that Bartok used a lot of palindromes and had an idea going from the start to the end, and it was cyclic, and I hear a lot of that within the motivic shapes of Satie's music. So rather than have lots of contrast immediately, both composers, for me, actually develop quite slowly. But as Caroline said, we don't know of any direct connection between the two at all.
The other interesting thing is, during this period you're talking about, Dan, a lot of composers were writing pieces for amateurs and children. Satie wrote a couple of collections specifically for children called Enfantine. We have Stravinsky's 5 easy pieces for piano duet that were quite frequently performed on concert programs at the time. And Bartok wrote a long series of piano pieces called Microcosmos, which were of progressive difficulty. And he also wrote specifically for children as well. So composers really looking at this new market for piano pieces, I suppose, and writing some stuff that is contemporary but also accessible to amateurs.
Well, let us talk then about Satie, his youth and early days. I mean, he was born in the 1860s. Where was, well, before we talk about his family, where was classical music at that point? Because I know this is post Beethoven. What I don't know the exact dates. Were Wagner and Tchaikovsky around then? Who were the people that would have been influencing the music scene that a young Satie was growing up with?
Well, Satie was born in 1866 in Honfleur, which is a very small, charming town in Normandy. It's a port. You've got lots of boats coming and going all the time. So he wasn't actually born in Paris, which was very much the centre of the musical world in France. He moved to Paris as a child when he was about 10. Now, the major figures in Paris in the early 1870s were Wagner was by far the most important composer, and there were very strong feelings both for and against him. Certainly Tchaikovsky was active at the time, Brahms, Germany, though he wasn't so much played in Paris, and within France, composers such as Saint-Saëns, Gounod. In the opera house, also Franck was composing at the time. In the opera house, people like Meyerbeer were still very big as well. So large-scale romantic composers were what was all the rage in Paris at this period.
What was his childhood like? What was it? What background did he come from his parents? Were they artistic? And did he have any? I mean, certainly he wasn't at a Mozart level as far as being a young prodigy. Yeah, but was he actively, playing around on the family piano or banging on kettle drums or something?
I don't think he was from a musical family at all. His mother was Scottish, and she died when he was only 6 years old. His father was not a musician, but he was, I think, an incredibly intelligent and interesting man. He spoke about 9 languages, and he spent much of his career as an interpreter. So it was an intellectually curious family background. It was unusual because, his mother was a Protestant as well, and his father's family was a Catholic. So actually, after his mother's death, Satie was rebaptized as a Catholic, so there must have been quite a lot of religious tension in the family. But it wasn't specifically a musical or artistic one. I think he had his first music lessons from a music teacher who was active in a local church in Honfleur, a Monsieur Vinot. So that's how he came across music. It wasn't through his family.
It's fascinating to think about, isn't it? Because Paris is all about the genres, the opera, the ballet. Whereas I think for Honfleur, we're talking about music in the church, listening to sacred music when he was in there, or having the piano lessons. Maybe he was aware of the organ music. I mean, certainly, as you probably know, there's the museum where Satie lived in Honfleur that you can go around, and it's up as a museum to show the type of lifestyle he was living when he was in Paris. So the top floor is actually based on a piece in the form of a pear, and there's this massive pear hanging from the centre of the ceiling. So it's much more about the idea of Satie as he was in later life. But it's fascinating to look at a composer that's come from an intellectual background but not a musical background, and how that then translates when he moves to Paris. You see those intellectual ideas and thought processes carried through what he's doing, but he wasn't a composer that wrote symphonies and a lot of orchestral works, as you might have expected, looking at the old guard of the 19th century. So he didn't buy into that tradition, it seems. Yeah.
His stepmother was a piano teacher, from what I've read, and then he went into a musical conservatory. He apparently didn't do well. Was this a case, do you think, of that just like with Impressionists versus the Solonistas, that was the musical world of Paris old and stuffy and just in need of being shaken up, and that Satie was just too out there? Or do you think that he was, in some ways, from what it said, from what I'm reading in different sources, that his teachers thought he was lazy and not disciplined?
There was definitely a bit of both. He didn't get on well with formal education in the conservatoire, and he was thrown out without a diploma. I think we have to think of him in more positive terms, though. He wasn't so much somebody who was embedded in the classical musical world when he was in his 20s. Instead, he hung out in Montmartre, in the cafe scene, and in the cabaret scene. And he made a living playing piano in this type of environment. So it was very much a kind of pop culture and experimental avant-garde culture he was connected with. He wasn't somebody who was very connected to the classical musical world really until about the early years of the 20th century.
So are we talking that he came from sort of a dance hall background, in terms of musically?
As I said, in Montmartre, it was more café, concert, where he might have been accompanying singers at the piano. Either they'd be singing popular songs of the day, quite often with satirical lyrics. There's some really funny stuff from this period. And what was extraordinary about Montmartre, it was also very much the centre of emerging art forms, such as the shadow play, where you have shadows projected on a screen and little figures kind of moving in front of the screen, acting out these plays or whatever. And Satie would be improvising music to that. So it was not only a pop culture, it was also very much an experimental culture and very much an alcohol-fueled culture.
Very much so, and experimental with the different arts, as you just said, which obviously feeds his later writing. What I find fascinating, if you're playing the piano accompanying a singer in cafe culture, you expect conversation and discourse around you, not really the centre of attention all the time. I do wonder to what extent that career and experience led to the idea of furniture music. That music can be there without you engaging with it, because his early career wasn't the centre of the stage. People weren't quiet and sitting to listen to him. They were there having a drink and conversation while he happened to be playing with a singer. So I think that really, looking at it retrospectively, seemed to have informed his later musical developments quite in a fascinating way, I think.
I think so, yeah.
That brings to mind something that I've often thought, and I've
spoken with. We couldn't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. It brings to mind something that I've often thought and talked with musicians, and that is that of the major art forms, literature, the visual arts, painting, film, music, and I guess to an extent ballet, because it's interpretive, or dance, is that music is the only of the major art forms that can work well and sometimes even better on a subliminal level. You can't open up a book and read David Copperfield and not be paying attention to what the words are saying. And you can't be watching a Kubrick film and not be paying attention to what's going on. But you can listen to, if I'm writing something, doing some work, I can listen to Beethoven and all of a sudden something, and Beethoven, and it gets under your skin. And I'm wondering if he was aware of that, because it seems to me there's only two ways to go knowing that. That is to go the Wagnerian way, where the music fills the room, or to go so small where you're doing just a little piano piece that someone's going to say, wait, is something going on there? And they'll say, they'll cock their ear to listen to it. So do you think that he was aware of what I would call the subliminal nature of music? And do you think that a lot of his compositions were in response to having worked in this rowdy cafe kind of environment?
I think it must have been. You only need to look at La Parade and the idea that the music's representing outside the circus, but you can really hear what's going inside as well. You can hear the idea of the busy, bustling life. The fact that he's integrated things like the typewriter and the shotgun. He wants the outdoor world to be sounded within that piece. And I think that really does represent two things happening at once, but neither in a complete distillation. I mean, of course, the subtitle of that being Ballet Realiste, the concept, is it realistic, really? But it's part of this whole paring down that he has. So we might refer to dreaded neoclassicism in a way. But if you look at sort of Rappeur from 1924, we end up with just four characters, only one oboe, one trumpet. It's really, really distilled. It feels like he's asking the listener to hear to every little note, every little thing that's happening, rather than the massive development of harmony that we're listening to the minutiae, in a way.
I would answer that in a slightly different way. I don't think most of Satie's work can really be viewed as background music, in the sense that it's something that could quite happily go along in the background to some other activity. I think the term furniture music should be reserved in Satie for the pieces that he actually did label as such. We're talking about a few works written from 1917 onwards. I think, though, if you look at Satie's smaller scale works, such as the Gymnopédie, as you say, they could not be more different from something like Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. But just because they're quiet and small scale doesn't mean that they can't pack an emotional punch. And I think that's something most interesting about Satie, that it's extremely simple and pared down, as Helen said, a lot of the time, and yet it's extremely moving. He showed that a composer doesn't need to make a lot of noise or to be working on a very grand scale in order to touch people.
Yeah. Well, I didn't mean it in a negative sense. I mean, I've written poetry, and I've been at poetry readings, and there's a lot of what's called slam poetry, where people will basically read a lot of crap and they'll gesticulate wildly and whatnot. Or you can just go on and let the words have the power. My point was that it seems to me that Satie went to that each note, each little, and I'm not a musician, so I don't have the vocabulary, but each little turn of a musical phrase had an impact, and you had to be listening to it. And so that if you have all this chatter, there might be only 8 people out of 40 in the room, though, but they would be the ones that would get it, and they'd be listening, and each little thing would twist and turn them. That's what I was meaning, that you can either go big to overwhelm people with it, or you can draw people to it by underplaying it.
Yes, I think there's a difference, though, between the sort of popular songs Satie wrote in the cabaret and these more intimate piano pieces, which I think certainly for the early works he wrote for himself. There's not very much evidence that the Gymnopédie, for instance, were performed at all until about 20 years after they were written. It was from about 1912 that composers such as Debussy and Ravel started promoting Satie in Paris concert venues, that great pianists of the period such as Ricardo Vignas, Marcel Meyer started programming his music. And that's really how Satie's early works, such as the Gymnopédie and the Nocturne, got into the Paris concert halls, about 20 years after it was written.
Mm.
But before then, these pieces were, as I said, more or less written for himself.
Well, let me ask about people that may have influenced him. You talked that he had gone to this conservatoire and had been kicked out, basically. Who were any musical predecessors, if any, or was it a sense that he fused, say, some of this more popular music with the classical? How did he get to being what he was, what he became? Either one of you.
I think that's a very good way of putting it, actually. He was drawing on elements from the pop culture, but he was also aware of what avant-garde musicians around in Paris at the time who were experimenting with unusual chord progressions. Debussy was a friend of his from the early 1890s, and they certainly exchanged ideas, took an interest in each other's music. And Emmanuel Chabrier was another composer who interested him a lot. He's a composer with a great sense of humour. His music's a lot of fun, and it's also really quite unusual harmonically speaking. You never quite know where he's going. It's surprisingly unpredictable, rhythmically as well as harmonically. So up to a point, I would say Satie was influenced by avant-garde composers of his time, as well as by the pop scene in Montmartre.
I agree, but for me, the way I look at music, the thing that's influenced me most isn't musicians, it's always the other artists he was the poets, the painters, just the ideas around artist aesthetics and how art's used for different things or performed in different places and what it might mean. So yes, less about the composers and the harmony and structure and influence that way, but more about what could I do that might have a reaction or something that is distinct because of the interplay between the different media. I'd almost describe it a sensory composer. I actually, in one of the chapters I wrote, described him, I think, as a visual composer.
Interesting.
Before I move on to a little bit further in his career, I just want to talk. I'm looking. It says that he was involved in some sort of a hoax, possibly, but that could be apocryphal. What was that? Because the art is often filled with claims of people just typing a bunch of crap and then saying, "Oh, this is some new poetry," or just taking something, swirling it on a canvas, and saying, "This is some new school of painting." I'm just reading here that. In mid-1892 here, and this is Wikipedia, so it could be wrong. It says he had his first hoax published, announcing the premiere of Le Bataille de Tristan, an anti-Wagnerian opera he probably never composed. So, do you know anything about that?
Rather than perhaps calling it a hoax, it's an example of Satie alighting on an interesting title. I mean, it's fantastic, isn't it? Le Bataille de Tristan, with that sort of rather shocking Wagnerian connection. And I've studied his sketchbooks, and you can see that he sometimes came up with an idea for a title, but he never actually composed any music for it. It was more unusual if these title ideas got out there in the public domain. So he must have thought, oh yeah, this is a terrific idea, let's just put it out there in one of these experimental art magazines he occasionally contributed to. So yes, there is truth behind that story. It's sometimes difficult to distinguish truth from fiction with Satie, but I think that one does actually have evidence behind it.
So by the late 1890s, I'm reading that he had applied around and tried to, I guess, get in what we would now call the system. For writers today, you could call it the MFA writing system, that there were similar academic systems back then in France. But he was rejected, and then he was making money just basically as a cabaret pianist again, and he had fallen on some hard times financially. What was his life around the turn of the century, though? You said it took a couple of decades before his work started getting played by some of these, I guess, stars of the era in music. So did he just spend a couple of decades basically being the weird guy at a cabaret, just with the dance hall girls? I mean, what was his life in this period, and what was he writing at this time?
The early years of the 20th century are a fairly obscure period in Satie's life and work. We don't know too much about it. The only evidence we have of him applying to an academic institution is, I think it was 1904, he applied to the Schola Cantorum, 1904-1905, when he decided that he did actually need some more classical training in disciplines such as harmony, counterpoint, and orchestration. So when he was 39, he did actually go back to school. So the years before the Schola, though we don't have a lot of compositions by him other than some cabaret songs, some of which actually sold fairly well. And we do have a piece, though, in the early years of the 20th century, the piano duet, three pieces in the shape of a pear, trois morceaux en forme de poire. Mostly this is based on cabaret songs he'd written. And by the way, there aren't actually three pieces in this. The piece has 7 movements. So just another example of his unexpected sense of humor, we should say.
Yeah. In this period, since not a lot is known, just in Googling about, apparently Satie had some of his own mythos. In the prior show that I did on Mozart, I talked about Mozart and to a lesser extent about Beethoven and all of the myths surrounding them. These are sort of like the twin towers of classical music. But I'm seeing that Satie apparently in the early 1890s was involved with, it says, a mystical order, the Rose and the Cross of the Temple, and he composed some music for them. What was his religious belief, or what was his belief system? Was he a communist? Was he a socialist? Was Was he? You said that he was baptized and then rebaptized. Did he become an atheist? What was his own personal opinions on politics and religion and things of that nature?
That's a very good question, and it's something that changed quite a lot throughout his life. In the 1890s, he was briefly attached to the Rosicrucian movement. He produced some beautifully calligraphed documents in pseudo-Gothic handwriting. Some of it just spelling out the tenets of the church. He made these marvelous line drawings of organs, really beautiful documents, and some very, very interesting piano pieces composed for this movement, which don't have any bar lines in them, and some of them were written for theatre productions, which had mystical characteristics, often with text by Tsar Péladon, who was the head of this movement. When he broke off relations with Tsar Péladon, due to religious differences, I think, Satie briefly formed his own church and carried on writing these beautiful tracts and documents, advertising his own church. After the 1890s, we don't have too much evidence about his religious beliefs. We do see him getting involved in politics in the late 1910s and early 1920s. So at different periods of his political affiliation, he was a member of the Socialist Party, and towards the end of his life with the Communist Party. He even stood for election on his local council. I mean, sadly he didn't get in, but I wish he had. I mean, just imagine Satie as your local representative. It would have been so funny.
I do get a sense of how Satie's national priorities changed, of course, around 1914, because we get Debussy wrote a letter, I can't remember who it is, saying, I wish I was doing something, I'm not able to do it, but Satie is able to train and protect his country. And there's lots of discussion about actually what he did and whether he was walking around the streets protecting and looking out for air raids, or he was running into neighbours, hunting and doing other things. I think there's a nice quotation in the Roll of Myers book that he would knock on the door and say, I'll come and die with you today, and hide away. But obviously he'd spoken to Debussy, who was still close friends with at that point, and must have said something positive about being able to do something for the nation in order for Debussy to say, I wish I could do that, I feel useless at the moment. As of course he was already ill with the disease that would have killed him by that point.
Yeah, I mean, Satie actually had a very strong civic sense. He'd take local children out on outings. He was involved in conducting a local choir and giving piano lessons to children. He saw this as a very important part of his life, I think. He even got a minor national decoration for it, which he was very proud of.
Oftentimes, especially with classical music, I know when I listen to it, and even as the musical pieces change, you get a sense of the mind behind the music. When I was speaking about Mozart last week, I said how, to me, Mozart is sort of like the Big Bang, just everything exploding outward, rushing towards you, whereas I said, when I listen to Beethoven's music, I think of King Lear wandering about a heath. With Satie, I get a kind of loneliness to it, but it's not the King Lear grand loneliness. It's like someone just sort of sitting in a corner observing the world. And in looking up his information, it seems that he only had one confirmed romantic relationship in his life, if you want to call it that, a brief several-month affair with some woman in his mid-20s. Do we know about that, and do you think that this was someone who was plagued by loneliness? And I'll follow up why I asked that in a moment. But there is the sense in the music, not even just the gymnopedias and the nocturnes, but even in some of the more fluid, complex pieces that I've heard, of someone that is apart from the reality, the world he lives in. Tell me about that state of mind, and if this romance or lack of a romantic life led into that, do you think?
I think it's very difficult to map a composer's private life and personality onto their music. It's not something I like to do too much. I think, though, a lot of people say they perceive this sense of loneliness in a lot of Satie's work. One thing I will say is some of his pieces, such as the ballet, for example, feature a good deal of repetition. So you wonder whether the music is going to go somewhere. And in traditional classical musical terms, Mozart and Beethoven, you would expect music to have some sort of goal direction, some sort of forward momentum. This sense of goal direction is very often absent with Satie. You've got this sort of rotating around a small number of ideas, and then suddenly it will stop and it'll move on to something else. So it's a rather different conception of time, and I think therefore a rather different conception of the emotional world of a piece of music, don't you think?
I completely agree, and I'm not quite sure the idea of loneliness is necessarily negative, because if we can believe the fact that he didn't have anybody visiting an apartment for a period of his life, he might have actually enjoyed wallowing in isolation and creating and working by himself. I mean, as Caroline's just said, the idea of changing the time and our experience of peace, that lack of goal direction, is something that I think wasn't accidental, that was worked through. The fact you have repeated motifs throughout, as we've said, Parad, you have repeated ideas. As we said at the start with the gymnopody, the first and third movement are almost identical. The changes really are timbre and occasional note, but really it's almost suspense or suspension of time that you re-experience music in a new way because it isn't developing. You really have to stand still and digest it. I mean, I know some people have even argued that he's the precursor to minimalism because of this static lack of harmonic development. But of course, harmonic development isn't the driver of his music. It's other aspects of listening to the quality of a song, listening to the texture. But of course, if you're in isolation and you've got time to listen, you experience sound in a different way. So, you know, even using the typewriter with an apparatus, you'll hear the different qualities of a typewriter if you have time to listen to it. So I think we need to suspend that teleological progression from A to B of time and really think about how we engage with that music. As Caroline's already said, the other piano pieces have been written largely for himself, might be the closest if one wants to try and find a parallel of working in isolation by himself.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there's a real meditative quality to a lot of his music. I think particularly if we listen to the works he wrote for Rosicrucian Church, they're mostly very slow expressions of unusual chords which strung together according to traditional classical rules. So it's as if he creates his own universe in his music.
I want to ask about a little bit more to do just sort of a little post-mortem psychologizing about what went into his art. And when I spoke last week about Mozart, we talked about the film Amadeus, which portrayed Mozart as sort of this fart-worthy fool. And just looking up, it seems that Satie, in a certain sense, had what would now probably people would probably wrongly, but would call some autistic kind of qualities. For example, it talks about him walking around Paris to himself carrying a hammer wherever he went, that he had a very weird diet. The things that he ate was quite odd, that he didn't consider himself a musician. He called himself a phonometrician or a phonometographer. And then there's even a listing in one of these sites of excerpts from his diary that, you know, where he says for something like, I sleep with only one eye closed very profoundly. My bed is round with a hole to put my head through. Once every hour, a servant takes my temperature and gives me another. So it seems it just seems that he was either he was putting on, or maybe he was one of these people that was either living his life as performance art before there was such a thing known as performance art, or he was just a very weird guy. Do we know biographically, was he someone that may have been considered now autistic if he lived now, that he was just this weird squirrely fellow, or was he someone that just, when people were around him, he liked to portray himself as the crazy artist? Is there any clue?
I would rather take issue with the idea of those two things being put together. Some contemporary psychologists have suggested he could have been on the autistic spectrum or could have had Asperger's syndrome, for instance. But, you can't diagnose dead people, and I think it's probably unethical to do so, actually.
Yeah.
As for the rather broader question of was he eccentric and funny, and yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the main reasons I'm attracted to him. I think he is such a funny guy. And there are so many different ways you can treat his writings. For example, the famous statement about him only eating white food, which some people have written very seriously about. Perhaps this is a symbol of, meditation or blankness in his life. I personally think it's an example of his sense of humour. A lot of the time, Satie's humour is based on reversing things. So, he will take something that's a set phrase or a well-known saying, and he will completely say the reverse. In the case of the white food, I think it's a comic reversal of a scene in a very well-known novel at the time, Huysman's novel À rebours, which is translated into English, I think, as Against Nature. Now, this novel was really notorious in the late 1890s because it had a scene based on a black dinner, this really sort of overheated, overwritten scene where all of the food being served at the banquet was black. And that was such a well-known scene in Montmartre circles where Satie worked at the time. I think he had the idea to reverse it in a comic way. So, well, I only eat white food. I mean, who knows how Satie's mind worked? It's a sort of unfathomable in many ways, but I think I'm onto something with that one.
I agree about his humour, but I just want to pick up on what you said about the performance art, because I think the fact he walks around dressed more or less the same, has the umbrella, has the bowler hat, I think that isn't just about him doing performance art before it existed. It draws a parallel with me, with those artists that were labelled as a dandy and were dressing in a particular way, or you had fashion designers that were actively dressing and projecting their fashion on the street. You only need to think of Coco Chanel, and she was taking the trousers of the horse rider into the fashion domain, into everyday dress. So the everyday dress said something about status, cultural practice, and it wasn't just about going out onto the street anymore, but it was about how you were going to present yourself on each occasion. Before we even think about performance art, I think that was not him being crazy or odd. I think that was a manipulated, planned idea that he was going to do that. I mean, we have some descriptions, I forget at the moment who said this, but he walked everywhere. He was always on foot, and that because he walked so far between where he was living, where he was working, that he was guided by the angels. How else could you walk so far? That he must have been carried by the angels. And I think this is all part of him developing some mythology around himself, actually, and making himself more than what he was. And I think that's part of his humour as well. It's certainly what attracts me to him. Yeah.
Late in his life, I'm seeing that he became friends with people like Jean Cocteau and Tristan Tzara. What influence, if any, did they have on him, or was he more the influence on them because he was older, do you think?
That's a fascinating question.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. This whole environment of Paris during the First World War is such a fascinating one. And Satie collaborated with so many figures from this time. He wrote the Ballet Parade with Cocteau. Picasso designed the costumes and painted the backdrop to it, and it was choreographed by Leonid Massine of the Ballet Russe. So it's a really marvellous fusion of the arts that Satie was involved in. I'm not sure in terms we can talk perhaps influence isn't exactly the right word, but there's quite a lot of common ground between these artists. If you look, for example, at Apollinaire's poetry, apparently the reason why his poetry doesn't have any punctuation in it is because once a publisher made such a mess of the publication, he thought, well, forget that, just delete the lot. So that's why he decided not to use punctuation. And some people have paralleled this with Satie not using bar lines in his piano music of the period. It's showing the artwork not only having its own sort of artistic dimension, but also having a visual dimension as well. You really get the sense that the arts were taking on characteristics of each other in this period, that the traditional dividing lines between the arts were dissolving.
I think, so, to go back to your original question about influence between the people, the division between the arts involving part communication between Satie and the other collaborators. So I'm thinking particularly of Parade and Cocteau. Of course, that wasn't their first collaboration. It was an attempt in 1915 when Cocteau was working on A Midsummer Night's Dream. And of course, that didn't seem to come to fruition. But you can watch an interview with Cocteau that's available on YouTube if your viewers wish to look it up. And it talks about the gestation of La Parade. And Cocteau makes it very clear that I went to Rome, I brought the Diaghilev Massenet. But then he ends the quote with, but Satie wasn't there. The whole interview, so it's very clear that he's in the driving seat and he's trying to give legacy to this piece, that it is his work. Of course, if we take Picasso in that work, there is a volume called Picasso's La Parade that looks at the artwork and looks at the artistic involvement. We haven't really had the other way of looking as Satie leading that, but a lot of the suggestions for other sounds in that production look as though they've come from the other collaborative artists. But if we look at Satie's letters at the time of the gestation of that work, there is one that he's writing to Cocteau, and he says, "You will write to me again, won't you? You will write to me," and he repeats it. And of course, there are some letters to other collaborators and other friends where he says what he's working on and talks about Cocteau's wishes and Cocteau's aim quite a lot, and he places himself in the letter deference to Cocteau. So I think he has a choice to make, and at that one he wanted to do something different, but he was choosing who was going to lead that collaboration. So musically he's led it, but he wasn't really leading the form and that would go with the other arts. I do think that's down to Cocteau. Of course, after that, Cocteau writing Coq L'Harlequin and ascribing Satie this leadership role, as it were, for these next young composers that formed as Les Six. He's almost become the marketing man for Satie in a way, and I think Satie gained a lot from that, and he knew that. I think that's why he's putting himself in that position.
At the same time, I don't think it's surprising that after Parade, Satie wrote Socrate, which was a setting of the death of Socrates, as written by Plato, translated into French by Victor Cousin. All of these collaborators were safely dead. So I think after working with Cocteau on Parade, he thought, but he actually wrote to a friend that Plato is a very gentle collaborator, he's no trouble at all. I think rather controversial. I think the very strong implication that, actually, I just want a little bit of peace and get on with my music and expressing this text without anybody constantly badgering me about what to do next.
Well, I want to talk about the music in a moment, but I just want to finish up on the biographical information, because he did die before his 60th birthday from cirrhosis. So I guess it's safe to assume that he was an alcoholic. Did he have any other addictive tendencies that we know of? He drank absinthe, apparently, which was, I guess, ubiquitous in that day. Did he have any other notable vices? I mean, apparently he didn't have much of a love life, as we had mentioned. Was he a consumer of drugs at that time? Was he one of these people who drank just to get away from a personal misery, or was he, someone anticipating, say, the 1960s and trying to expand his mind through absinthe and other things?
We don't have any evidence that he took drugs. And in fact, when some acquaintances of his in 1924 were involved in drug taking in Monte Carlo, there's its in letter evidence. He was actually, he said he was actually quite shocked by it. I think it's fair to say that he liked to drink and that alcohol was his primary vice. He did once write, however, that people will always want to buy you a drink in a bar, but nobody ever thinks of lining your stomach with a sandwich. I think he rather liked eating very much, but perhaps he didn't get the opportunity to eat as much good food as he would have liked.
I'm just thinking about repetitive behaviour. I suppose the stories that you read about all the hats and the umbrellas and the retention of newspapers falls into that repetitive behaviour, and I do wonder whether that is in terms of safety. The fact that things are always going to be the same and it will always be there, whether we needed that safety. But like you say, with drink, I think working in a cafe context, you can't really get away from alcohol, so it becomes the norm for him in many ways. Yeah.
Well, I do want to talk about the music, and I don't, as I say, I'm not a musician, so I don't have necessarily the vocabulary, so I may put things in a very plain way that has a term. So feel free to jump in and correct me. But I want to look large scale at his career and then move in towards periods and specific pieces. If we look at the large scale of his almost, I guess, 40-year or maybe more than 40-year writing career, is there a trend that emerges? Do we see familiarities or similarities between the early, the middle, and the later Satie, or do we see him growing or then reaching a peak and then sort of radically shifting? What is the overall arc of his career?
I think, broadly speaking, his early years were a combination of these popular cabaret songs he wrote, plus these rather simple, modally inflected piano pieces that he wrote for himself. The kind of harmonic language he was using in these piano pieces is something that carries on throughout his career, and it's shared by a lot of French composers. So kind of mixed tonal elements with modes, things like flattened sevenths or whatever, and you have a lot of chords that do not resolve according to traditional classical rules. Really, it's a harmonic vocabulary that's very much shared with Debussy. In the early 20th century, after he studied at the Schola Cantorum, we see him combining this language with more complex contrapuntal ideas, writing fugues that don't necessarily go very far. He'll start off on something that looks like a very imitative texture, and then he'll just cut it off as if he gets bored and move into something completely different. And in his later years, we see a certain simplicity entering his music. He wrote this piano piece in 1917 called Sonnetique bureaucratique, which is very closely modelled on a sonata by Clementi, written, I think, in the turn of the 19th century. As if he's reinventing classical vocabulary partly by parodying it, and that's very much a characteristic of his later years, musically speaking.
Yeah, in terms of a direction, I agree with everything Caroline said, but I also see him from being an isolated figure writing by himself and then starting to work with text through song and then collaborating on larger scale pieces such as the ballet.
True.
So we've sort of got one side which is the harmonic development, the textual development. On the other side is the collaborative development and opening up to working with other people. And they both seem to be about expansion and trying new ideas, but not necessarily developing things too far and using repetition. Hence, the collaborations often had the same collaborators involved. So from Arad to Mercure, we've still got Picasso, we've still got Massine. So there's often once he's tried something, it works. You find the same idea or the same collaborators returning. Again, it might be the idea of security. You always have the umbrella and the bottle hat. When you collaborate, if you don't like change, you'd work with the same people. And I do see a parallel there between his working practice and his personal life that we're aware of.
So he did not do any operas or a full ballet or anything, correct? Was that because he never had the opportunity? Did he have to, did he need to schmooze more in order to get work like that? Or was he just not interested in those things?
I think he was largely not interested in writing works for conventional venues such as the Paris Opera House. We do see him writing fairly large-scale ballets towards the end of his career for the Ballet Russe and the Ballet Suédois, and also the Paris Ballet Company that was founded by Etienne de Beaumont, who was one of his main patrons of his last years. So he did have these connections in ballet. I don't think he was really interested in opera in that sense, and he certainly wasn't involved with many of the traditional large Paris concert-giving organizations.
It looks like that he did works, they're listed here as dramatic works, things like Prelude for L'amour de Monsieur Mouche, a play, some other plays. He also did vocal music, apparently, with singing, which is something that's unusual, at least when lay people like myself think of classical music. Tell me about some of those works. Were these vocal pieces, were they the equivalent of pop music of the day, or were they for a more elevated audience?
It's a bit of both. You actually get both of these styles within Satie. He's not someone you can very easily pigeonhole as being simply a classical composer. So we have a lot of songs that were written for the cabaret popular market, especially in the late 19th century. But then, when his music began to be played in small venues in Paris, things like salons and converted art galleries, we see him writing songs for written to text by contemporary poets, friends of his such as Léon-Paul Fargue and René Chaloux. Often these have got a rather appealingly comic character to them. They're really, really tiny little songs, but they're great to perform and to listen to. So you see songs really either end of his career, both in the cabaret career and in his later time when he was being played in Paris small environments.
Again, I don't have the proper vocabulary, but I know when I've listened to, as I mentioned, I'll listen to a YouTube thing where they'll have 2 or 3 hours of this is Liszt, this is Bach, this is Beethoven, this is Satie. One of the things that I seem to listen, see or listen to in the music that stands out to me is that when I listen to some of the older classical composers from the 17th, 18th, early 19th century, there seems to be this contrapuntal movement that will get, well, I guess you would call it a theme, and then would get a counter theme, back and forth, and then the two might synthesize into one another. I don't seem to hear that even in some of the longer pieces of Satie. They seem to be, if I was to visually say it, it seems like there's a straight line, and then it wiggles a little bit, and then it wiggles this way, and then it goes back. There isn't, whereas if I'm thinking of, say, a Beethoven or a Mozart piece, we'll have a big flowering up this way at a branch, and then we'll go off onto another branch. Is simplicity something that is constant throughout Satie's music? I guess that would be the term I guess I could best use.
I think that with Satie, the sort of shape you might think about, rather than being a flowering or a development, it's very often the loop. So you've got the idea that's repeated, looping back on itself, and that's the sort of idea that's not going to be developed in classical terms. Again, I would say he's not someone you can easily pigeonhole as a classical composer in the formal perspective as in any other perspective, really. And all you can do with a loop, if you don't want to just repeat it forever, is just stop and go on to something else, perhaps another loop. So he had his own approach to form. Other thing I would say about Satie, which is very unclassical, is his music doesn't change key very often. And this is something else he has in common with pop music composers. My former supervisor, Robert Orlich, has done a lot of study of Satie's notebooks and harmonic language. And I remember one thing he told me once, that Satie really doesn't know how to modulate. And it's absolutely true. You even see his notebooks, he's trying to learn how to do it, and I don't think he ever really got the hang of that.
Now, this is where I find fascinating, because we're talking about simplicity, but actually to produce simple music or to pen that music down, the amount of complex processes and ideas behind it. So yes, he doesn't seem to have managed the modulation, but at the same time to develop music, and some of these longer ballets in particular, and to sustain that music out modulation, it means there's complexity in other areas, such as timbre and texture. So I think I agree with what you're saying, but I'm always very careful about the word simple in connection with Satie, because I don't see this music as being simple personally. I see the complexity of texture, timbre, the use of the instruments, and the engagement with the other art forms so vast. It seems like a whole universe of other things, which is partly why his idea of time and the non-teleological way of creating music is so fascinating and has so many people writing about it, because you can experience a particular moment in time because there is so much there that is away from the traditional notions of harmonic development, structural development. So even though he's got a lot in common with popular music, so we might find something that you could say is a repeated passage could be referred to as a vamp in popular music, but that would repeat the same over and over and over again. But when you get that repeated motif, as you get in parade, or as you get in some kind of music, it does change, but it changes either through the orchestral texture, or it changes through the articulation that you notice, or it changes because of the moment it is within the scene. As you see with the Chinese conjuring La Parade, it's the same thing. When you put that with Basquiat's choreography, actually it changes because the dance changes and the feel of it adapts. So I think it's actually more complex, not complicated, but complex than he's often given credit for.
I know I was just listening last night to Vivaldi's Four Seasons, and I know he does also, he's got violin and guitar concertos, where it seems to me that there's a stark difference between Vivaldi's orchestrated pieces and his pieces for a single instrument or a type of instrument. It seems to me Satie, his piano pieces remind me a lot of Vivaldi's guitar concertos in that kind of loneliness, the simple, I guess you'd call it chords or progressions or whatnot. But did Satie always compose on the piano? Did he compose just for the piano, or did he compose, for the lute and the lyre and the organ like Bach? Or
he composed in many different genres, really. In terms of solo instruments, there's an enormous amount of piano music. Whether he actually composed at the piano, I don't have an answer to that question. We do know, for instance, that Stravinsky composed at the piano because he actually wrote about that. But Satie wrote very little specifically about his working methods. There are a small number of orchestral works by Satie, these later ballets, and Socrates is very interesting. That's a vocal work that was originally written for string orchestra and voice. There is also a piano version as well. There are also a small handful of pieces for violin and piano. There's En Bas que mon Citer, that's particularly lovely, and the Choses vues à droite et à gauche. Not an enormous amount of variety in terms of the media he was writing for, but when he wasn't writing for himself, he was writing for specific performers or to specific commissions. So those were the opportunities he got.
The reason I ask, and again I ask this as a layman, is that it seems to me that if one were to play on a violin something like an OCN, it would have a totally different emotional impact than the piano. And same thing too. I mean, if what is a Bach's toccata, you know, that famous organ music that's been used in the Phantom of the Opera type kind of horror film, that would be totally different if you tried to play that on a violin as well. So the reason I was asking is that it seems to me that when I think of Satie, the piano seems to be his métier. If you tried to do, you know, a gymnopédie on, you know, even on something like what do you call the xylophone or something, it would almost be comic and absurd, where it wouldn't have the emotional resonance that it does on the piano. To what degree do you think that, and this is not only for Satie but music in general, that the compositions for a particular instrument, do they always matter that much, or are there some pieces by Satie or some other composer that you think can go across a broad spectrum? You know, is there a piece by Satie that, you know, is just as effective, if maybe in a slightly different way, if it were played by a full orchestra rather than a single piano?
That's a fascinating question, because you're at the time when composers are writing contest pieces and examination works for particular instruments at the conservatoire. So, you know, you've got an issue of whether the composers write for their own instrument or not. I'll let you go.
Yeah, I don't think there's a simple answer to this question, actually. Especially from the 19th century to the present day, we see composers really imagining pieces for specific sounds. I think it's a mistake to see music as some kind of abstract notes on the page type thing. It's representing a sound, and most composers have a very strong and very particular oral imagination, so associating the note with a particular instrument, and that's really essential to their conception. But I'm not somebody who would be narrow-minded and say that it's not possible to arrange or orchestrate pieces for different combinations. I mean, look at Debussy's orchestration of two of the Gymnopédies, for instance. It's actually very close to the kind of orchestral textures that Satie was considering at the period. It's not just the case that Debussy is bringing his own conception about the piece. And I think many pieces can work very effectively for other instrumental forces. There was recently, for instance, an album of transcriptions of Satie for acoustic guitar by the guitarist Steve Hackett. He used to be in the UK rock band Genesis. They're really respectful transcriptions of Satie. They're not adding anything to him, harmonically speaking. It sounds absolutely fantastic on the guitar. You know, you might not imagine that this is something that Satie could have perceived himself, but it works, and that's down to the skill of the arranger and the performer. I mean, perhaps as well because the acoustic guitar is quite a quiet and solitary sort of instrument. It responds quite to the mood of a lot of these Satie pieces.
I think that's the key, though, isn't it? It's the solitary instrument. With the piano and guitar, you play it yourself. You're not having to be with somebody else. And I think the fact that he's writing for himself initially with the early works, and it was only transplanted into the repertoire later, says a lot about how he thinks about his writing. Whether he wrote the piano or not, we don't know. But the works being for him, or the works being for him and a singer, because that's the context, it's very intimate. I think that's the most important thing. I mean, certainly in the sketchbooks, just thinking of those I've seen, looking at Gloria di Fortissimo, because it's a piano that he writes for all the on three staves, you can see he re-annotates a number of passages for piano. Some of it's to look at how it responds to the imagery. So I'm thinking of the water chute, for example. You see that same passage re-annotated about 5 times, or how he writes the performance instructions change. So the crescendo, or the use of the pedal, the use of the staccato, whether he wants it held, whether he wants it short, is really so piano specific that I see those works as being his understanding of his instrument. So it's all, all well and good for someone to arrange it, but I think he was really inside how he performed and what the piano felt like for him. So I think it's probably more to do with his somatic experience as a pianist as well, because he was an active performer. He wasn't just composing for piano without playing it, which I think is really important to
Well, let me turn towards legacy. I want to talk about the legacies from his death almost a century ago till now, and going into the future, and then I'll ask for some closing remarks. What impact do you think that he has had on classical and maybe popular music? We mentioned the John Cage and the repetitions of the 840. The piece of Vexations, but where does he stand now, say, in the canon of classical music and music, world music in general? Helen, if you want to go first.
That's a really interesting question, because I would always say he stands outside. He doesn't really sit in one area or really. I mean, his music is part of piano examination syllabuses. So his piano works very much as a diet for new persons learning the instrument. So in that sense, he's absolutely cool. The ABR setback within the UK includes most levels, from early grade 1, the learning upwards. In terms of his place in the concert hall, you do hear concert versions of some of his works, but I would say there's a slightly different question if we said where's his place within ballet or stage works, because we're not seeing regular reinterpretations of those works yet. There has been some, but we're not seeing regular revival of Latin Bed, for example. We are seeing the costumes and the extracts of some of the letters presented when we have exhibitions. So there was an exhibit at the L'Opera in Paris only a few years ago that included the costume designs, including extracts of the score, but it wasn't coupled with a fresh performance or a new version of the performance. So I think in many ways Satie has been plagued by the fact that he has been a collaborative artist. But it's not just a case of restaging his music, it's a case of restaging the whole piece. I think we have to take out the different genres. He is a repertory staple piano, but if we take the ballets, it's not a repertory staple. We're aware of them; they're known. It's a completely different discussion, I think.
Yeah, interesting. He isn't a composer who, as a piano composer, works very well in conventional concert halls and in conventional classical programs. But he's really, I think, found a niche in the recording industry and in broadcasts and in home listening and home playing. So I think the CD and other mass media such as that, YouTube nowadays, have done an awful lot to keep Satie in the public consciousness. And if we're looking at his legacy on subsequent composers, there have been lots of composers who've been specifically inspired by the gymnopédie. Really right up to the present day, people like John Adams have written a pseudo-gymnopédie in the second movement of his piano concerto, and the Chinese composer Chigang Chen, in a recent work, Iris Dévoilée, also writes a first movement gymnopédie that really caught the imagination. And then we see more experimental composers on this side of the Atlantic, Howard Skempton and John White, for instance, who've been really inspired by Satie's model, as well as people such as Cage, who I feel have been more influenced by the ideas than the actual music of Satie.
Well, I want to get some closing remarks from both of you. I'll start with Caroline first, and you can wrap up any thoughts you have about Satie. But if when you do, I do want to ask you, for anyone just coming to the works of Satie, if you could give your own personal idea of what you think of his one or two best pieces are, and also name one or two pieces that you think have not that are worthy but have not fared as well in the public consciousness. So any closing remarks, and then the best and neglected work?
Yeah, I think starting with the piano works is a wonderful idea. There are some excellent recordings out there by historical pianists such as Daniel Varsano, William Massalos. I particularly like Alexei Lubimos recordings in a more contemporary sense. He's done some terrific recordings of the Rose Croix repertoire. And recently you've had pianists like Anne Kofelek, Alexandre Tarot, Noriko Ogawa as well, recording the piano music. So I would start with any of those performers and get one of their CDs or listen to some of their work on YouTube or Spotify. That would be a really, really good place to start. As for the less well known, people often talk about his furniture music, his music that was written to be experienced in the background. What's always troubled me is that very few people have actually heard this stuff. In fact, I recorded some of the furniture pieces with students at the Royal College of Music about 2 or 3 years ago. Some of them didn't even exist on YouTube. And I actually discovered something that had not been performed before. So I would certainly direct people to my YouTube channel if they want to get the experience of that. And if I had a dream project which has not yet been realised, Satie wrote some of his furniture music for a play by Max Jacob, which is not even yet published. I discovered the manuscript in the Bibliothèque Nationale, the National Library of France. I would love for that play to be published, to be performed. It's a really unique fusion of theatre and music, and it would be fantastic to get it out there in the public domain.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned. I did hear in listening to some Satie stuff a couple of weeks ago. There is like I forget who the hell it was, but he did a jazz variation on one of, I think, the first Gymnopédie, and it was odd because instead of this in between, you get this sort of, I guess, again, forgive me, I don't know the term, but you get sort of this sort of piano scatting in between, like the famous notes, the little, and it was interesting because I was listening, I was saying to myself, and I had to look because it says something like freeform jazz interpretation or something, or fantasia or something on the Gymnopédie. But it's interesting to hear those variations. Helen, let me ask you to wrap things up. Any closing remarks? What you think are his best pieces, and also something that needs more attention.
Well, I agree with Caroline. To start approaching Satie the piano works is the obvious one, but what I would say as an educator, someone who's teaching analysis, performance, and history, the one I've really found engages the students is to take some of the middle passages from La Parade. As soon as you hear the shotguns, the lottery wheels, the typewriters, it really gets students to engage with all the sounds that are integrated into a musical score. So I found that's been really engaging both when I've been teaching in school, college, and at university. So that's my go back, that's sort of a staple work that I go back to introduce Satie through, because it's so exciting, it's so different for the era, there's visual images one can show as well. So I often do that. I think you've also got to think about what a spectator is accustomed to, because for visual artists or poets, they might actually be open to the visual dimension of his works, as I've already mentioned with Sport and Fortissimo. But a personal thing, I'd quite like to see and put on a staging of his Le Piège de Medusa, which was written in 1913 but not staged in the 1920s. And actually, more than that, I'd like to couple it with Stravinsky's Histoire du Soldat, which I did as a lecture recital a few years ago and toured it. The reason being they're both pared down ensembles with very few wind instruments. There's only a few characters. The Histoire's got the two, Le Piège He's just got the four. I quite like this idea of whether that could become a mobile theatre piece and to become a repertory staple by using the collaboration on the stage with Stravinsky. That's a very personal thing. I'm not aware of it being done, but I would love to do that personally.
I like the sound of that.
Well, I will link to Helen's webpage, and I'll also link to Caroline's YouTube page and also her Twitter page. You can send me the link to your new webpage at the place you mentioned earlier, and I'll link to it as well,
Sure.
Caroline. So I want to thank you for spending an hour and a half or so speaking about Erik Satie. So thank you, and have a good weekend.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Good weekend.